Some medieval travelers noted how frost would dot their bedrooms, icicles hanging from bed curtains or basins that froze overnight. Chronicles barely recorded it, treating it as normal. If your room didn't develop a thin layer of frost in January, you were in the minority. Despite all that, people survived. Somehow, they knew how to keep from turning into popsicles. Part of that was ritual. Once night fell, households would do whatever they could to conserve warmth. The big castle might be vast, but everyone focused on shrinking their living space. Fires were banked, beds surrounded by curtains, clothes layered on until walking was secondary, all in the hope that the drafts wouldn't be too brutal. Now imagine yourself walking into a medieval bedroom. Sometimes, the peasants had it better. Their wooden and wattle homes might trap heat from a hearth more effectively than the vast, echoing chambers of a lord's castle. A modest fire in a small hut could keep an entire family reasonably warm. Meanwhile, a noble in a stone fortress, shivering in a space so large that even 5 roaring fireplaces wouldn't make much impact. That irony wasn't lost on folks back then. Some surviving letters from monks and noble visitors mention how hard it was to get a good night's sleep in winter castles, describing the beds as grand but the nights as bitter and freezing. A few even recommended travelers pack extra cloaks, not just for style, but for survival. As you keep imagining yourself lying there, you start to appreciate just how much ingenuity it took to survive those nights. You didn't just crawl under a blanket and hope for the best, you layered fabrics, piled on furs, drew the curtains tight, and sometimes shared your bed with friends, animal or human. Every step was about creating tiny zones of warmth within an environment designed by nature and architecture to be relentlessly cold. This shifts how you see medieval life. These people weren't just warriors, lords, monks, or maidens, they were survivalists. Every bedtime was a challenge, each winter a trial, and sleep, which we now take for granted, had to be carefully engineered, with customs and rituals passed down through generations. Imagine how grateful they'd be for each flicker of warmth, a dog snoozing at your feet, hot stones pressed near your bedding, or the small victory of keeping ice from forming on your beard overnight. These moments would stick with you far more than any feast or hunt. Survival made life memorable. So tonight, as you lie in your warm bed with the hum of central heating, take a moment to think of those who once slept in stone chambers, shivering through long, bitter nights. They endured, finding ways to sleep in places that should have been uninhabitable. Even in this grand space, heat only traveled so far. The further you sat from the fire, the colder the air grew, making it seem like the walls themselves breathed out frost. Warmth rose upward and was trapped in the smoke-stained rafters, while those on the floor wrapped themselves in cloaks and huddled close. Honestly, only a lucky few stayed warm, and everyone else pretended they were. One quirky detail chroniclers mention is that feasts sometimes doubled as sneaky heating sessions. Nobles scheduled their biggest gatherings during the coldest months, knowing that the combined body heat of hundreds of guests plus the fire would make the hall somewhat bearable. Some accounts say servants were even told to stand closer together just to generate more warmth. You could say feasting was as much about survival as celebration, but that glow of warmth didn't last. When the feast ended, the minstrels packed away their instruments, and the guests staggered to their beds. The fire was allowed to burn down to embers, glowing red, fighting the cold one last time as shadows stretched long across the stone walls. That warmth you cling to each evening would fade fast. Within an hour or two, the great hall would fall silent and frigid again. Imagine yourself now, lingering by the fire, reluctant to leave, stretching your hands to absorb every last spark of heat. Cheeks flushed, but your back already starting to feel the cold seeping in, reminding you how heavy the stone stairs are. Smoke stings your eyes and clings to your hair, yet you dread the climb up that spiral staircase to your chamber. Historians still argue whether some castles had more advanced heating systems for their halls. A few believe vents and flues allowed circulation of warmth, especially in later centuries. Others think it's wishful thinking, noting that medieval building tech simply didn't prioritize comfort. Most agree the harsh reality was just that, the truth. Travelers often complain more about the journey from the Great Hall to the sleeping chambers than about the sleep itself. That short walk, from warmth into cold, was described as a shock to the body. People spoke of shivering all night because of that walk. It was as if the castle itself punished you for daring to feel comfortable. The fading glow of the hall was also a mental cue, knowing that once you left, the night would be long and merciless. The Great Hall wasn't just a room, it was a ritual, a gathering of warmth before surrendering to the cold. Every torch extinguished, every cup drained was another step toward a shivering ordeal in bed. Even in candlelight, you could sense how fleeting comfort was. The roaring fire now whispers softly, sparks popping and dying out. A servant pokes at it half-heartedly, then gives up, letting the embers fade. The sounds of laughter and feasting are gone, replaced by the quiet groans of the castle settling into the night. So you turn reluctantly and ascend the stairs, cloak pulled tightly around you, as the warmth of the hall fades with each step. The glow lingers in your mind like a dream you wish would last, but already your toes numb, fingers sting, and you know the rest of the night will be a struggle for heat. That brief glow kept people sane, a ritual of gathering, feasting, and basking in firelight before the cold took over again. Without the Great Hall, the castle would have been unbearable. With it, at least, people could remember what warmth felt like, if only for a few hours. You climb higher into the keep, away from the diminishing glow, and immediately, the air changes. The fire's warmth disappears, replaced by a damp cold that clings to your bones. The walls are thick, sometimes 12 feet of stone separating you from the outside. It sounds protective, but here's the irony: those very walls that stopped arrows and siege engines also trapped the chill inside. If you've been in a winter basement, you know the feeling. The stone holds onto the cold like a memory, radiating frost even when the outside warms. Medieval builders knew strength and permanence, but not comfort, turning their fortresses into paradoxes, defenses against men yet powerless against the weather. People were willing to try almost anything to stay warm. Picture it now: you step into a bedchamber in late January. The fire in the hearth is small, maybe flickering low. The walls tower around you, slick with condensation, and even wrapped in wool, you shiver. The bed stands tall in the middle, heavy curtains drawn around it. Behind those curtains, the air might be a few degrees warmer, a tiny cocoon from the cold, but outside, it feels like being buried alive in stone. The psychological toll was just as harsh. People described fearing the cold more than hunger or even sickness. At least hunger or illness would pass eventually. The cold never seemed to relent, night after night in winter. Living in a castle, escape was nearly impossible. That feeling of being trapped inside your own home left its mark. You can imagine lying there, pulling the blanket tight, listening to the wind slipping through arrow slits. Your ears feel frozen, fingers numb. Even your dreams are haunted by images of ice and fire. The stone walls aren't a shield, they're like an endless refrigerator, never turning off. That's where perspective shifts. Castles weren't glamorous daily. They were survival tools. Yes, but at what cost? Comfort was sacrificed for security. Each winter's night proved that stone might protect from arrows, but it wouldn't keep you warm. The more you think about it, the clearer it gets. Sleeping in a medieval castle wasn't about peaceful rest. It was a constant, low-grade war against the environment. The enemy was invisible but relentless. And the battleground was always the same: the chamber, the bed, your body. You shuffle across the cold stone floor, where instead of carpets or polished wood, you have a humble layer of rushes strewn around. They weren't just for aesthetics, they were a practical attempt to soften the cold, soak up spills, and most importantly, act as a crude form of insulation. Their strong scents masked the smell of rotting scraps, but it also offered a touch of comfort in smoky, damp rooms. Picture settling into bed, catching a faint whiff of lavender beneath the overwhelming smell of wet wool and wood smoke. It wouldn't warm you, but it could make the night a little more bearable. Historians debate how effective these rushes really were. Some argue they genuinely provided warmth by creating an insulating layer between your feet and the cold stone. Others see them mostly as symbolic acts of order and cleanliness, noting most heat escaped through walls and ceilings anyway. The evidence isn't clear-cut, so the question remains: were the rushes a medieval warming tool or just a messy tradition wearing a veneer of practicality? Imagine lying in bed as a servant scatters fresh rushes across the chamber. They crunch softly underfoot, releasing faint aromas as they're pressed down. For a moment, the room feels cleaner, almost civilized, but you know that by morning, the rushes will have soaked up moisture again, starting the cycle afresh. Think of the sensory overload in such a bedroom. Beneath your sheets, wool or fur provides comfort, but around you lurks the musty smell of old rushes, the sharp tang of herbs, and the ever-present smoke clinging to your clothes. You hear the rustling of mice searching for crumbs. Every detail reminds you survival, not luxury, defined your sleep. Yet, there's a kind of ingenuity in it. These folks took simple materials, plants from river banks and fields, and turned them into tools for enduring long winters. They didn't think in terms of carpets or insulation but in whatever could push back the cold. As you imagine resting your head in this chamber, you realize even the floor was part of that nightly fight against the chill. Stone was the enemy, rushes formed the fragile shield. Every morning, it was a question of how long these defenses would hold before dampness and decay claimed them. You sit at the edge of the bed, running your fingers over piled layers of cloth. If there's one medieval secret for surviving the night's cold, it's fabric. Some believed sleeping under too much linen was unhealthy, as linen supposedly drew out heat from the body. To counteract this, they layered wool or fur above and below, creating what could be called a textile sandwich: linen cooled, wool heated, fur sealed it all in. Whether this worked scientifically is questionable, but it reflects how folk wisdom mingled with comfort. Scholars still debated the social significance of these textiles. Was fur primarily about survival? Or was it mainly a status symbol? On one side, inventories show wealthy nobles amassed vast quantities of fur coverlets. On the other, poorer families managed without them, relying on coarse wool. Some argue fur mainly signaled power and rank, others say it was an essential safeguard in drafty castles. The reality probably lay somewhere in between, both a practical warmth provider and a mark of prestige. Now picture yourself beneath these layers. The wool caresses your skin with a faint itch, rougher than modern fabrics. On top of that, dense fur presses against you, almost suffocating. But at least it keeps the cold out. The blankets, heavy with their weight, push you into the straw mattress beneath. You shift slightly, yet any bigger movement risks letting in icy air into your cocoon. Your breath warms the space near your face, while the rest relies entirely on this fabric barrier. The quiet of the room magnifies every sensation: the rustle of linen, the coarse scratch of wool, the faint musky scent of animal pelts. It feels intimate, primal, even humbling. You're wrapped in the natural world's skins and fibers, each thread and hair a reminder that survival depended on transforming the environment into armor. And that essence of turning textiles into a fortress is at the heart of medieval sleep. Resting meant erecting a fortress within a fortress, not with battlements, but with sheets and furs. Every night, they built a barrier against the cold with whatever textiles they had. Without them, even the grandest castle chamber might feel like the crypt's interior. People believed strongly in their importance. Portable beds became a noble essential. Now, imagine yourself sliding into one. The bed creaks beneath you, straw springs rustle, and you reach to draw the curtains closed. Instantly, the air feels different, still cold, yes, but no longer whipped by drafts from arrow slits. Your breath fogs less quickly. Your body relaxes into the layered covers, and you have a faint hope that you might actually fall asleep. The curtain muffles the distant drip of water from the walls, the cough of a servant down the hall, even the bark of a dog outside. Inside, it smells of fabric and fur, faintly musky but comforting. You only hear the rustle of blankets as you shift. Outside might be vast and unwelcoming, but here, in your bed, you've carved out a small pocket of life against the cold. Not foolproof, of course. Some nights, the curtains froze stiff with condensation, or smoke from the hearth drifted inward, choking you awake. Feather beds could also turn suffocatingly hot, trapping heat until you woke drenched in sweat, even in winter. A humorous complaint from a 15th century letter tells of a guest who moaned that his host's bed swallowed him like a goose in a pot. Too many feathers meant you sank in too deep, and instead of a gentle sleep cushion, you spent the night struggling to surface. For most, though, the straw tick was the norm: a large sack filled with straw, hay, or reeds, stuffed until it felt like a crude mattress. Peasants, soldiers, even castle chambers used them. They were cheap, easy to refill, and at least kept you off the icy floor. But straw had its own problems: it flattened fast, poked through the cloth, and often hid fleas. People had to beat the bed regularly, literally hitting and shaking the straw to fluff it up and chase out pests. By morning, your body might itch from straw scratches, but at least you'd survived the night. Some sources note that folks would add herbs to the straw, not just to mask the sour smell but also to keep pests at bay. Lavender, mint, pennyroyal, these would give off a faint scent, covering the damp haze odor. If you've ever slept on a straw mattress, you know that smell never quite leaves earthy, musty, clinging to clothes and hair. Scholars still debate how common feather beds actually were. Some suggest they were rare luxuries for the highest classes, while others point to records showing middle-tier households owned at least one, hinting they were more widespread. The evidence is patchy, but it suggests that the choice of sleeping surface was a detail considered important enough to record carefully. Imagine yourself lying on a straw tick in a drafty chamber, kind of like being wrapped in a primitive version of modern comfort, with all its little flaws. Keeping the body alive in cold, ruthless stone chambers. As you drift off in your imagined bed tonight, you realize that medieval sleepers were never passive. Every mattress, humble or lavish, represented effort, adaptation, and a small victory against the cold. It wasn't just about collapsing into bed, it was a strategic decision, sinking into feathers or enduring straw, all in the hope of surviving until dawn. Even the most elaborate bed, with curtains, feather mattresses, and layers of blankets, couldn't guarantee safety on its own. The real difference on the coldest nights wasn't furniture, it was company. Sleeping alone in a stone room meant your body heat simply seeped into the walls. Sleeping beside others meant warmth multiplied. Bodies pressed together like radiators in the dark. Noble families grasped this, though they rarely admitted it openly. Servants often slept in adjoining rooms or on pallets at the foot of their lord's bed. It wasn't just about service or security, it was practical. More bodies in a space meant higher temperatures, even if only by a few precious degrees. The warmth might not be obvious at first, but come midnight, when frost clung to the inside of shutters, every extra body counted. Medieval monastery accounts reveal monks sleeping in long rows, their pots or straw-filled beds close together in drafty dormitories. Their motivation wasn't solely discipline but survival. In those crowded quarters, body heat created a thin layer of insulation. The same idea applied in barracks, where soldiers huddled in rows, cloaks pulled tight, trusting that together they'd hold off the cold better than alone. An interesting story from a 14th century English manor illustrates this. A nobleman will specifically ordered that his favorite squire be allowed to sleep near his chamber fire. Scholars interpret this as more than favoritism, a recognition that companionship's warmth was as valuable as inheritance. Sharing a bed or chamber wasn't just about intimacy, it was a privilege of warmth. And there was another element at play: animals. Dogs, in particular, became literal heaters. The phrase "a three-dog night" may come from later folklore, but the truth is rooted in reality. Medieval folk often let hounds into their beds, not just for companionship, but because the animals radiated heat. Large mastiffs curled at your feet could mean the difference between numb toes and cozy comfort. Share whatever warmth they had, and hope the night was merciful. Picture blowing out your candle and settling under the covers. It's not just the blankets or curtains that keep you alive tonight, but also what you're wearing. Unlike today's pajamas or going to bed nearly naked, medieval folk often went to sleep bundled up as they were during the day. Clothing became part of their insulation. Records and surviving garments show that the typical bedtime attire was the nightshirt, a loose, long linen tunic-like garment. Linen might not sound warm, but it was practical. Easier to wash than wool, soft against the skin, breathable. Over that, they might add an extra wool tunic or even a cloak, especially in colder weather. More layers meant better insulation. One detail that stands out is the nightcap, or coif. These were small cloth caps tied under the chin or pulled snugly over the head. Why the focus on head covering? Because it was widely believed, quite sensibly, that most heat escapes through the head. A medieval sleeper without a coif was like a knight without armor, dangerously exposed. Illumination in manuscripts even shows figures tucked into bed with their heads wrapped, looking more ready for travel than dreaming. The length of night shirts varied. Poor families used what they had, often their under tunic, repurposed for sleep. Wealthier nobles commissioned more elaborate nightwear, embroidered with fine threads or edged in fur. Some women had sleeping hoods with flowing ribbons, though those probably weren't very practical in real life. Shedding your heavier outer layers, slipping into a long linen shirt, and pulling a snug cap over your ears. The cool air nips at your neck until you draw the blankets up. Every piece of fabric forms a tiny barrier, building a cocoon around you. The room might be drafty, the bed chilly, but your body is a fortress of cloth. The sensory sensations are vivid, cool, slightly ruffling and warming as it touches your skin, while the wool smells faintly of sheep and lanolin, earthy and comforting. Your cap gently presses around your head, muffling sound and creating a sense of enclosure. You shift into position, wrapped tight like a parcel, waiting for sleep to take you. Nightclothes had more purpose than warmth, they also served modesty. In a time when sharing beds was common, being half-dressed or bare was unthinkable. Even married couples were often portrayed in manuscripts wearing caps and long shirts in bed. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about propriety. Whether you were a lord, lady, servant, or soldier, your nightshirt and coif had social as well as practical functions. Consider the nightly ritual: dressing not down but up, layering more cloth, tying knots, smoothing wrinkles, all before blowing out the candle. Today, we associate nightwear with relaxation, but for the medieval sleeper, it was armor against the elements. So tonight, as you pull your blanket, imagine those long-ago figures. They looked more like travelers than dreamers, clad in linen and wool, heads wrapped tightly against the darkness. Their sleep wasn't effortless, it was carefully engineered, stitch by stitch, layer by layer, against the endless siege of cold stone. Picture the moment before you slip beneath the covers, a servant approaching with a long-handled pan, brass glinting softly in the firelight. Inside, hot coals crackle and hiss, filling the room with the scent of ash and heated metal. This was the medieval warming pan, simply yet brilliant, because no one wanted to crawl into sheets that felt like ice. The routine went like this: the servant moved the pan back and forth under the bedclothes, the coals radiating heat through tiny perforations, puffing the sheets with warm smoke, filling the air with a faint woody aroma. For a few minutes, the bed transformed from a frozen slab into something nearly inviting. Give me a few minutes of comfort, and I'll endure the rest. As you imagine lying there, drifting off with the faint scent of embers lingering on your sheets, you realize how ritualized medieval sleep truly was. Every night involved a choreography of tools, garments, and gestures. The warming pan wasn't a luxury for show, it was part of the survival kit. Without it, many nights would have begun in misery rather than rest. You shift in your imagined bed, pulling the heavy blankets closer, when suddenly you feel a weight press against your legs, a warm, solid shape curling into the crook of your knees, contentedly settling down for the night. You lie wrapped in linen and wool, curtains drawn tight. Outside, the wind wails past the battlements. Your toes are icy until you feel the warmth of a dog pressed against them, coarse fur, solid body, smelling of the hunt and outdoors, yet you welcome it willingly. Another dog might be curled at your side, and soon you're cocooned in more than just blankets, living heat. The room might still be freezing, but inside the bed, the world feels transformed. Of course, having dogs in bed had its downsides: they shed hair, drag in dirt, and sometimes hide bones under the covers. Insects traveled with them, spreading to people. But the trade-off was worth it: better fleas than frostbite, and a messy blanket better than a sleepless night. The sensory experience is unforgettable: the earthy smell of dog fur, the faint scent of smoke on your clothes, the weight of heavy blankets, and beneath it all, the steady rhythm of breathing nearby. It's no wonder people loved their animals with affection bordering on reverence. Sharing warmth meant survival. The image of the three-dog night, though a phrase from much later, captures the essence of medieval sleeping habits. One dog meant manageable cold, two indicated serious chill. Surviving the bitter cold. Who then, truly, slept warmer? The answer might surprise you. Nobles had grandeur: feather beds, fur blankets, warming pans, and thick canopies, but wealth didn't always equate to comfort. Their chambers were vast, built for display as much as rest, and that extra space made them hard to heat. Even with roaring fires, stone walls soaked up warmth like a sponge. So, a lord might lie on heaps of down and fur, yet still breathe air that froze into mist before his eyes. Meanwhile, peasants lived in humble dwellings of timber and dorm, small enough that a single fire could warm the entire space. A thick straw roof acted as insulation. Families huddled close, often with animals stabled at one end, and that combined heat made the air far more tolerable than in a drafty keep. A visitor to a 14th-century English village was mildly astonished to note that, although the huts were modest, they retained warmth much better than the Lord's Tower. Yet, status influenced comfort more than warmth. Nobles had access to finer materials, high-quality wool, imported furs, softening linen, while peasants made do with coarse blankets, patched until threadbare, or sheepskin smoked into rough bedding. Their beds smelled strongly of wool and hearth smoke, and though insulated well, they never looked or felt luxurious. A fascinating record from manorial records shows that peasants sometimes slept right on benches near the fire, children curled in their laps. They risked sparks and smoke, but staying close to the hearth guaranteed warmth. In contrast, the noble's chamber, separate from the main hall, often lacked that quick source of heat. Comfort, therefore, was unevenly spread, not always in the way you might assume. Today, researchers still puzzle over the true hierarchy of warmth. Did wealth always mean better sleep? Or did peasants in their small but cozy cottages manage winter nights more easily? Evidence shows both. Some argue that nobles' abundance of textiles kept them warmer. Others claim that the smaller, communal spaces of lower classes offered more practical heat than aristocratic grandeur could achieve. The debate remains open, showing how sleep itself reflected social divisions. Now imagine both scenes side by side. In the castle, a noble shifts beneath heavy layers, his breath curling white, the vast room echoing with every gust of wind against the shutters. Down in the village, a peasant family squeezes onto a straw mattress before the hearth, children nestled like kittens, the scent of animals wafting from the nearby stall. Entire beds and furnishings were moved seasonally. Servants carried feather beds, linens, and tapestries from one chamber to another, creating temporary resting places wherever the king chose to sleep. It was a logistical challenge, but for those living in stone castles, mobility was a must for survival. There's even a note from a Burgundian courtier who complained in a letter that he lost his chamber to the cold one year. The walls, he said, turned so damp and frigid that he refused to sleep there, choosing instead a narrower room facing the rising sun. His words remind us that, in castles, the building itself was an enemy, rooms conquered by cold, surrendered, and retaken with the changing seasons. Archaeologists and architectural historians still debate whether every castle really had multiple seasonal chambers, or if it was a luxury of the grandest estates. Some argue most castles had only a few rooms suitable for sleeping, forcing residents to endure the cold where they were. Others point to evidence, window placements, fireplaces, surviving records that shows deliberate design for seasonal living. The question isn't settled, but the image is compelling, a noble family migrating within its own walls, like birds shifting nests with the weather. Now imagine yourself following this routine. In autumn, you start to look toward the sunlit side of the keep, knowing those long nights will soon demand every advantage. Servants begin dismantling your bed, hauling its frame, mattress, and hangings away piece by piece. It was fluid, not fixed. Beating the cold required movement, planning, and constant adaptation. You didn't sleep where you wanted, you slept where the sun, wind, and dampness allowed, then started anew each year as the earth turned. Stand for a moment by the narrow window of a medieval chamber and feel the draft brush past your skin. Unlike today's homes with their glass panes and sealed frames, castle windows were vulnerable openings in the wall. They served as defenses against arrows but let in the wind too. Without glass, without double glazing, without insulation, these openings were just shutters or stretched cloth that kept out little more than rain and birds. Written records of medieval households show that in many castles, glass was so rare it was reserved for chapels or the lord's private oratory. Ordinary chambers had wooden shutters, thick planks that could be barred from the inside. In summer, they were left open for light and air, but in winter, they shut tight, creaking in the wind. Yet, what alone wasn't enough to block the cold, drafts seeped through cracks, making the room damp. A practical fix was to stretch cloth across the opening, sometimes linen soaked in oil or wax to make it translucent and weather-resistant. During the day, this allowed a soft, amber glow in like sunlight through parchment, while at night, it dulled the wind's shriek but never silenced it. The fabric fluttered, the frame rattled, and sleepers learned to live with the constant reminder that their fortress was permeable. An interesting detail appears in a 13th-century French household record describing horn windows. Thin slices of animal horn were scraped translucent and fitted into wooden frames. These offered a sturdier alternative to cloth, they admitted pale light and stood up better to the weather, though they yellowed and warped quickly. Imagine peering through such panes, seeing the world blurred as if looking through fogged glass, but inside your chamber, the air was just a touch less savage. Rooms glowed faintly, shadows distorted, as if the outside world were behind a veil. At night, though, even these coverings would freeze solid, turning into fragile sheets of ice. For the nobles, the irony was striking. Their tall towers symbolized status and defense, but they also exposed them to icy drafts. Guests would often note that the higher they slept, the colder it felt. A peasant might envy a lord's wealth but not the draft whistling through a tower window. Yet, amid it all, there was beauty too. Picture lying in bed under moonlight, the shutters slightly cracked, letting silver glow spill across the floor. The cold was real, yes, but there was poetry in the shadows, the outline of branches against the curtain, the faint, shimmering glow of snow outside. Medieval sleep was a delicate mix of discomfort and wonder, harsh nights tinged with fleeting moments of fragile peace. When you draw your curtains tonight, think of those ancient windows. They weren't just barriers, they were reminders that, no matter how thick the walls, the night always found a way in. Sleep wasn't about completely conquering the cold. It was about learning to endure it, draft after draft, until morning arrived. Imagine approaching a castle's hearth, craving warmth from the fire. You'd think a fire in a stone room would bring comfort, but the truth was often less cozy. Medieval fireplaces were enormous, the chimneys so wide that entire trees could be fed into them, yet, despite their grandeur, they weren't great at heating the room. It's simple physics, the wider the chimney, the more heat escaped straight up with the smoke. Flames roared, sparks danced, logs turned to glowing embers, but step just a few paces away, and your breath would still mist in the cold air. The fire created a bright, hot oasis in its immediate vicinity, but beyond that, the castle chamber remained painfully cold. Household records reveal just how much would such warmth required. A single winter week in a sizable castle could drain an entire wagon load of timber. Managing forests became an ongoing concern, not only for construction but for fuel as well. One French lord bitterly lamented in his letters that keeping his great hall warm had cleared the woods faster than any war had. Firewood was consumed rapidly, yet rarely offered the comfort one might expect. There are humorous stories, too. Guests would joke that noble fireplaces were large enough to roast an ox but so feeble they couldn't truly warm a man. That exaggeration hits close to home. These enormous hearths provided a visual spectacle, light, and a certain grandeur, but did little to stave off the relentless cold of stone walls. Some households tried placing iron firebacks behind the flames to reflect heat into the room. Others lined hearths with tiles to hold warmth longer. Still, these were mere patches, small fixes in the face of an overwhelming problem. A blazing fire might keep your feet warm if you sat directly in front, but your back would stay icy, and the bed across the chamber might as well be outdoors. Scholars debate how effective castle fireplaces really were. Some argue they offered genuine warmth when combined with heavy drapes and furniture, creating layered insulation. Others see them as more symbolic, signaling status and ritual more than providing comfort, since most of the heat simply escaped up the chimney. The actual effectiveness probably varied widely based on resources, design, and climate. Imagine yourself in such a room. The fire crackles loudly, sparks flying onto the hearthstones. Smoke curls up, leaving a faint smell in the air. Your face flushes and warms, but your shoulders stay cold. You shuffle closer, extending your hands until your sleeves almost tighten around your wrists. Then, reluctantly, you retreat to your bed across the room, only to realize the temperature drops with each step. By the time you're under the blankets, it's as if you've been sitting outside. Conversely, smaller hearths in modest homes often proved more effective. A single fire in a small cottage could warm the entire space, despite the smoke. The cramped quarters meant that fire and body heat worked together to maintain a tolerable warmth. The grand noble fireplaces, however, burned through resources but left chambers only half warmed. Grandeur did not necessarily translate into comfort. Yet, the ritual surrounding fire held meaning. It was about more than warmth, it was about gathering, light, and the reassurance that something was fighting back against the darkness. People prayed before the fire, spun stories, dozed in chairs beside it. Even when the heat didn't reach every corner, the glow offered psychological comfort, a flicker of life amid the cavernous cold. When envisioning a medieval night, don't picture a roaring fireplace saving you from frost. Think instead of a fragile island of heat in a sea of icy air, lasting only as long as you kept close, and vanishing the moment you climbed into bed. The hearth was as much a performance as a tool, and medieval sleepers learned to be grateful for whatever warmth it could provide. Lean closer to that glowing fire, and momentarily, safety feels within reach. But then a harsher truth asserts itself: smoke. Fireplaces weren't exactly paragons of cleanliness or efficiency. They spat out fumes, covered everything in soot, and filled the rooms with a haze that stung the eyes and settled on every surface. Staying warm by the fire meant inhaling smoke night after night, accepting blackened walls, and waking up with lungs coated in ash. Records from that time often complained bitterly about it. One monk in northern England mentioned that his cell got so coated with soot from the hearth that he coughed more than he prayed. Even nobles weren't exempt. Court documents talk about women lamenting ruined gowns and linens stained by persistent smoke. A freshly cleaned tapestry could turn gray within a single winter. The architecture made it worse. Chimneys were broad, rough shafts without the draft controls we have today. Smoke didn't always rise straight up, it drifted, swirled, and clung to the room. If the wind shifted the wrong way, it would pour back inside, forcing everyone to cough. Just imagine trying to sleep while smoke burned your throat and made your eyes water. Travelers' notes even mention that some folks deliberately coated their walls with lime or clay, not just to brighten the rooms but to hide the streaks of soot. The black residue was stubborn, but this trick at least briefly restored the illusion of cleanliness. The smell, however, was permanent, a mix of charred wood, damp stone, and burned wool that clung to bedding and clothes. Scholars remain divided on just how tolerable these smoky spaces were. Some say that medieval people simply grew accustomed to it, their bodies and expectations toughened over time. Others believe that even they recognized the toll on health, as many medical texts complain about choked air and blackened lungs. Maybe both are true, they endured because they had to, but they rarely stopped grumbling about it. Now imagine yourself in bed after such a night. Your hair smells of smoke. Your blankets carry the sharp scent of ash. When you cough, a bitter taste warms your tongue. The bed curtains trap some of it inside, so even your little retreat bears the ghost of the fire. Your room might have been warmer, but only at the expense of fresh air. Peasants had no better luck, many homes had no chimneys at all. Smoke from the central hearth rose straight up and filled the rafters, slowly seeping through the thatch. Children were born into houses perpetually hazed with smoke, their lungs blackening before reaching adulthood. Yet, most people saw it as normal, even believed the smoke preserved the roof timbers and kept away pests. Survival and superstition blended into every breath. The senses were overwhelmed, your skin prickled with soot particles, your eyes constantly watered, and the rushes on the floor gathered black dust. Servants swept tirelessly, but it often seemed futile. Every winter was a struggle against smoke and cold, and they knew they couldn't win one without worsening the other. Still, despite all the discomfort, fire was indispensable. No one could survive a castle winter without it. So, people made peace with it, displayed their smoky tapestries proudly, endured coughing fits, scrubbed soot from their faces each morning. Warmth demanded sacrifice, and that sacrifice was clean air. People used light as a makeshift heater, even when the effect was minimal. The risks were obvious: flames could easily topple, and thick bed curtains of wool and linen were highly flammable. There are records of fires ignited by careless placement, destroying entire rooms. One especially grim German tale talks of a squire who fell asleep with a candle on his bed rail. He awoke to find his blankets ablaze and barely escaped with his life. The servants blamed his recklessness, but the rail trigger was necessity. He'd wanted a bit of warmth too close at hand. Scholars still debate whether medieval folks fully understood these dangers, or whether their routine candle use led to complacency. Some suggest that inventories of burned fabrics show many accidents were common but accepted. Others believe the wealthy minimized risk by assigning servants to keep watch late into the night. Regardless, the constant tension between safety and comfort persisted. Now, imagine being in such a room. The fire in the hearth has burned down to embers, shadows creeping up the walls. A single candle flickers on a wooden stand near your bed, its gentle glow casting a golden halo that reaches your hands as you pull the covers tighter. The faint warmth from the flame is enough to make your face feel a little less frozen. The flickering wax drips slowly down the side, and a faint whiff of smoke hangs in the air. Outside your curtain, the rest of the room dissolves into darkness. The shared dormitory. Not everyone enjoyed the luxury of heavy curtains, feather beds, and private attendants. Monks, soldiers, apprentices, and servants often shared spaces where comfort was secondary to endurance. Take the monastery, for example. Monastic rules prescribed a simple life, which meant dormitories were large halls filled with rows of beds or mats. The stone floor stretched endlessly, interrupted only by narrow high windows. Each monk had a small cot or straw mattress, sometimes just a wooden plank with a thin padding. Beds were placed so close that one could hear the breathing of the neighbor. Privacy was absent, but warmth came from collective presence. Accounts describe halls that echoed with coughing, snoring, and the rustle of coarse wool blankets at night. The air was thick, cold, and damp, but the mass of bodies helped retain more heat than an isolated chamber ever could. One chronicler remarked that the cloister was warmer than the Lord's Tower, for the monks lay together like sheaves. In military life, the scene was similarly stark. Soldiers housed in castles or camped in long barracks, stretched out over straw-filled beds with weapons close by. Blankets were shared, cloaks doubled as covers. The smell was pungent: sweat, leather, smoke, straw, a stew of humanity. Yet, even this rough camaraderie made sleep possible, shoulder to shoulder, night after night. The rules of certain nocturnal orders reflect this reality. Candles flickered in communal halls, not just for illumination but to offer comfort through their gentle glow. Did they sleep together for camaraderie, or because the cold made solitude impossible? Probably both. Now picture yourself lying in one of these halls. The straw beneath you crackles as you shift, a neighbor coughs, another turns over, sounds amplified by the vaulted ceiling. The air hangs heavy with smoke and sweat, yet feels less biting than solitary chambers. You tuck your wool blanket tighter around your chin, grateful for the shared warmth but craving silence. The rhythm of the dorm is unmistakable. Snoring rises and falls like waves, interrupted by the occasional murmur of dreams. Somewhere, a rat scurries across the rushes, ignored by men too exhausted to care. The draft slips in through high windows, but shared body heat dulls its chill. You may not feel cozy, but you feel secure, safer than alone in a vast, echoing stone room. Similar arrangements existed for apprentices and household servants. Castles brimmed with side chambers and lofts where young boys or maids spread out straw pallets, sometimes tucked under staircases or in storage rooms. They layered cloaks and huddled close, turning humble corners into makeshift bedrooms. Unlike nobles, they couldn't command warming pans or feather beds, but proximity was their advantage. Their quarters were smaller, tighter, and warmer because of it. The sensory experience of these communal spaces was unforgettable. Rough wool against skin, the musky scent of bodies pressed close, the gentle hum of breathing, the scratch of straw, and the faint drip of water from the ceiling. It wasn't peace in the modern sense, but it was endurance. People didn't expect silence or solitude, they expected survival. So tonight, as you lie in your own bed, think of those long halls where monks chant prayers before extinguishing their candles, soldiers collapsing in rows after battle, servants curling up in hidden corners. Their warmth didn't come from silk or fur but from each other. In medieval times, sleep was as much about community as comfort, a reminder that even in the coldest castles, survival was rarely a solitary act. You've imagined yourself in this crowded dormitory, but even here, warmth isn't guaranteed. Fires need tending, and in the dead of night, someone always had to leave the warmth, stumble across the floor, and stoke the embers. Sleep was rarely uninterrupted in medieval times. People woke often, not just because of straw discomfort or neighbors' coughs, but to keep the fire burning. Their internal clocks worked differently. No one expected a solid 8 hours of sleep. Instead, they lived with what some scholars call segmented sleep. The pop of wood, the faint glow pushing shadows away, the smell of smoke mingling with wool. Your fingers ache, but reviving the fire gives you a quiet satisfaction. When you slip back beneath the blankets, the bed feels even warmer by contrast. People living in cottages followed the same rhythm, no protective grate around the open flames on the floor, so a careless sleeper risked burning or worse. Someone always got up to add logs, poke embers, watch over the fire. Sleep came in fits and starts, always tied to that heartbeat of flame. And in those moments, it becomes clear that medieval knights weren't simply unconscious for long stretches. They negotiated, managed, and guarded their rest. They rose, worked, prayed, checked on animals, whispered to loved ones, and then returned to sleep. In the darkness, life didn't stop, it just slowed, punctuated by firelight and breathing. As you lay in your warm bed tonight, think about the constant vigilance those stone halls demanded. Closing your eyes was never truly complete. You sit by the hearth as a servant pours mulled wine into a cup. The aroma of cinnamon and cloves fills the air, hiding the smell of smoke and damp wool. You sip slowly, warmth spreading through your chest. Your eyelids grow heavy, your limbs loosen, and when you finally climb into bed, the blankets feel less oppressive, more inviting. At the foot of the bed, a cloth-wrapped stone radiates gentle heat against your toes. For once, you don't dread the night. These comforts were fragile. The heat faded quickly, drinks lost their warmth, and by midnight, the chamber was cold once more. What these rituals offered wasn't lasting relief, but a brief psychological grace, a moment of ease that made the relentless cold bearable. As you sleep tonight, consider how deeply medieval people craved warmth. They crafted clever devices, sought fleeting pleasures, and turned even a hot drink into a survival tactic. Their nights weren't effortless, but they were inventive. Every bath, every heated stone, every sip of ale was a quiet act of rebellion against the cold. Even after baths or warming stones or mulled drinks, they never relied solely on practicality. Cold wasn't just a physical foe, it also threatened spiritually and supernaturally. Nightfall was dangerous. The very air seemed suspicious, suspected of harboring illness and evil forces. So, they relied on charms, rituals, and superstitions to protect themselves as they slept. Hanging amulets above the bed was common, simple wooden crosses, relics believed to hold saintly power, or herbs wrapped in little pouches. Rue, mugwort, and juniper were favorites, thought to ward off evil spirits and even the poisonous night air. Picture lying in bed under a canopy decorated with fragrant bundles, their scent mixing with smoke from the fire and the musk of wool blankets. Prayers served as another shield, monastic rules advised reciting psalms before sleeping, and noble homes often repeated prayers like the Ave Maria at bedtime. Even peasants whispered charms, half prayer, half spell, crossing themselves against frost or fever. Some murmured verses over children, pressing kisses to their foreheads to keep the night hag at bay, a spirit blamed for suffocating sleepers. A curious detail from a 15th-century German household manual suggests placing iron objects, like a knife or scissors, under the bed or pillow. Iron was believed to repel demons and fairies slipping into rooms during the dark hours. The faint glow of this metal in the firelight was a silent guardian against unseen threats. Rituals linked directly to warmth also played a role. One folk belief claimed that turning your shoes upside down beside the bed would keep frost from biting your toes, while another said whispering the names of 3 saints before blowing out the candle would prevent your body heat from in the night. To us, these seem like quaint superstitions. To them, they were as vital as an extra blanket, strategies to survive the cold. Scholars debate how seriously people took such practices. Some believe charms and prayers were heartfelt, woven into daily life, while others see them as habitual gestures, performed out of tradition even if not entirely believed. Either way, these rituals reveal something fundamental. Sleep was never fully trusted, it was a vulnerable time when cold, illness, and spirits could all strike. People needed both physical and spiritual safeguards. Imagine lying in a medieval bed now, curtains drawn, a low fire flickering, shadows dancing across the chamber. Overhead, a sprig of juniper hangs, its sharp scent slicing through the smoky air. Beneath your pillow is a small iron knife, hidden but reassuring. You softly whisper a prayer, words rhythmic and gentle, then make the sign of the cross before pulling the blanket tighter. The night feels safer, as if these rituals have carved out a circle of protection around your delicate body. The sensory details deepen the mood, the rustle of herbs brushing the canopy, the metallic scent of iron near your head, the warmth of wool against your skin, and the faint echo of whispered words. In that moment, faith, superstition, and survival blend seamlessly. Present-day practitioners do similar things, though with different objects, crude charms, carved wooden figures, knotted cords, or simple herbs gathered from fields. Parents tucked garlic under children's pillows, believing it kept sickness and spirits at bay. Even animals were included, blessed cows and sheep in buyers' pens before nightfall, thought to bolster the household against frost. Everywhere, the cold night wasn't just endured with blankets and fire but with rituals. The medieval mindset sought warmth in the body and security in the unseen. To sleep was to step into mystery, where prayer, herbs, iron, and flame worked together to battle the long darkness. When you settle in for the night, think of those small gestures, the flip of shoes, the sprig of rosemary, whispering a saint's name. They were tiny comforts, no less real for being intangible. For medieval sleepers, survival wasn't purely physical, it was also about spiritual armor woven from faith, habit, and hope. Step back and look at the whole space, beyond blankets, dogs, or charms. The architecture itself shaped how well they could face the night. Castles, built for defense, gradually evolved to become more livable inside. The result was a patchwork of features, some clever, some symbolic, designed to squeeze warmth out of stone. One such space was the solar, a small private chamber set aside for the Lord and his family. Unlike the vast Great Hall, the solar was smaller, located higher in the building, and easier to heat. It usually had its own fireplace, thick hangings on the walls, and windows facing the sun. This wasn't luxury for luxury's sake, it was strategy. By making the room smaller, the fire's warmth had a better chance of lingering. Tapestries, woven from wool or silk, lined the walls, displaying colors, saints, hunts, mythical creatures, and served also as insulation. Some tapestries, 10 or 20 feet wide and heavy enough to challenge servants to hang, helped keep the cold at bay. Behind it, the damp stone was hidden, and the air near the wall felt a touch warmer and less icy. Standing close, you could even catch the scent of wool's lanolin, earthy and faintly soothing. Archaeological digs reveal that many chambers had wooden paneling to serve the same purpose. Oak planks formed a barrier, trapping pockets of air and making the space feel less like a cavern. Servants would stuff gaps with tows, moss, or rags to block drafts. It was imperfect, but it showed how people went to great lengths to turn unwelcoming fortresses into livable homes. Intricate details appear in estate records. Noble families often carried their finest tapestries from castle to castle, like portable walls. They weren't just decorations, they were essential for survival. A lord traveling without his hangings was like a soldier without armor. Experts in medieval domestic life still debate how effective these features really were. Some argue they genuinely cut drafts and kept heat in, while others believe the psychological comfort mattered more. A decorated room illuminated by firelight might feel warmer even if the temperature hadn't changed much. That debate highlights how perception and survival often intertwined. Now imagine walking into such a room. The door shuts behind you, muffling the wind's roar from the corridor. The walls are draped in crimson and gold tapestries, their woven figures flickering in candlelight. A fire crackles in a carved stone hearth, smoke curling upward. The timber ceiling seems lower than in the Great Hall, creating a cozier space. It's still cold outside. You see your breath, but it feels less harsh than in the open chambers below. The sensations build upon each other, the rough tapestry beneath your fingertips, the faint blend of wool and smoke, the crackle of fire on oak logs. You almost believe this is a sanctuary, even as the chill lurks just beyond the hangings. The same principle was at work in simpler ways elsewhere. Peasants, instead of woven tapestries, plastered or daubed their walls, then hung coarse wool or patchwork cloths to reduce drafts. Brightly painted fabrics with simple patterns could serve both as insulation and decoration. In their own way, peasants also transformed bare walls into protective shells, shrinking the space into something more livable. Another subtle trick was putting sleeping quarters on upper floors. The heat rising from the Great Hall provided a small advantage. Children sometimes slept in lofts above the kitchens, where warmth from the ovens lingered. It wasn't really about privacy but about capturing every bit of available heat. And yet, despite all these efforts, the cold never truly disappeared. It could only be mitigated, not banished. Still, the presence of wall hangings, cozy chambers, and wooden panels shows how deep people's desire was to turn stone prisons into actual homes. As you settle in tonight, picture those rooms illuminated by tapestries, faintly warmed by fires, softened by wooden planks and vibrant cloth. They weren't cozy by today's standards, but they stood as acts of defiance. Against cold stone, against frost, against the endless winter night, medieval households layered their spaces architecturally, artistically, psychologically, to declare, "This is ours, and here, we will endure." Close your eyes and imagine the scent of a medieval bedroom. It wasn't like today's lavender-infused linen ads. Instead, it was a complex blend of odors, built up from the moment you stepped through the heavy wooden door. To really understand how people slept, you have to understand what they smelled. because every breath reminded them of their living conditions. The first scent was always smoke. Fires blazed nearly non-stop in winter, and without good chimneys, the soot drifted back into the room. Walls darkened, the air thickened, and that smell seeped into the very fibers of blankets and curtains. Even freshly washed linen carried a hint of ash. Lying down at night, you'd carry the smell of smoke in your hair, clothes, even your skin. Next came damp wool. Blankets, cloaks, clothes rarely dried fully in winter. Moisture seeped through stone walls, condensed on surfaces, soaked into textiles. Wool stubbornly held onto that earthy, lanolin-rich, slightly sour dampness. Imagine pulling the covers up to your chin and smelling fabric that felt warm but never quite fresh. Then there was the odor of straw and rushes. Floors covered with rushes, bedding stuffed with them, and they rarely stayed clean. Trampled by muddy boots and infested with mice, rushes quickly turned musty. Straw mattresses, initially grassy-scented, after weeks of use, reeked of sweat and decay. Every shift in bed released more of that earthy smell into the air. One 14th-century household manual even suggested sprinkling dried herbs, rosemary, lavender, meadowsweet, on the rushes to sweeten the chamber. For a few days, it worked. The scent mingled with the heavier odors, just enough to seem more civilized. But soon, the herbs wilted, crushed beneath feet, their fragrance faded, and the sourness of old rushes returned. Then there was human scent. Hygiene was limited. Baths were rare, sweat constant. People slept layered in clothes that absorbed the day's odors: leather, wool, unwashed skin. Beds shared by families or companions compounded this effect, creating an atmosphere meant to be inhaled, sometimes comforting, sometimes overwhelming. Scholars debate just how overpowering these smells truly were. Some claim that medieval folks, used to these scents, hardly noticed. Others argue they were acutely aware and thus prized herbs, perfumes, and incense all the more. Evidence from inventories and medical texts seems to favor the latter. Food and drink. You might not see supper as part of sleep, but what you ate before bed and the warmth it gave inside mattered just as much as any blanket. In winter, households depended on hearty stews, thick potages of barley, peas, and root vegetables simmered slowly in large cauldrons. These meals clung to the body, leaving a heavy fullness that made the cold easier to bear. The warmth of the broth lingered in the stomach, spreading outward, convincing you that you could endure a freezing room a bit longer. Nobles might add meat, spices, or cream to enrich the dish, while peasants relied on onions, cabbage, and whatever scraps they had. A combination of actual warmth and psychological comfort. Imagine yourself getting ready for bed. A servant offers you a wooden cup of mulled wine, steam rising from the surface, carrying spicy aromas to your nose. You sip, the glowing liquid sliding down your throat, relaxing your body, loosening muscles, eyelids growing heavy. When you finally get into bed, the blankets seem less oppressive, more welcoming, as if the warmth has already settled inside you. For peasants, the routine was simpler but no less vital: a bowl of hot porridge made from oats or barley to settle the stomach, families gathered around the fire, faces illuminated by its glow, bodies nourished for the long night ahead. Children licked the last bits from their wooden spoons before snuggling beneath blankets. The memory of warmth from food helped them ignore drafts slipping through shutters. An odd folk belief even held that eating garlic before bed could prevent frostbite, perhaps because garlic improved circulation or simply because it was warming to the palate. Farmers in cold regions sometimes chewed cloves of garlic before lying down, its pungent scent filling the chamber as strongly as smoke or wool. The medieval bedtime food scene is vivid: cauldrons bubbling, wine hissing over the fire, the aroma of herbs and spices blending with damp rushes, and the heavy, comforting weight of stew in the stomach. Every flavor played a part in the fight against cold. So, when you think of medieval sleep, don't separate it from the supper that came before. Food served as fuel, warmth, and even medicine. Without it, the cold felt sharper. The blanket felt thinner, the night longer. With it, the body could endure. Each spoonful, each swallow was an extra layer of defense, a quiet, invisible shield against the icy stones surrounding you. Now imagine the most vulnerable inside a medieval castle: children and the elderly. Their bodies, less resilient to chill, often bore the brunt of winter's harshness. If a healthy adult or servant shivered through the night, a child might wake with blue lips, and an old woman might not wake at all. Survival for them depended on additional care, shared effort, and sometimes just luck. Noble household records show that children rarely had their own rooms. Instead, they slept near warmth either in nurseries close to the kitchen or grouped with servants. Young pages and squires, in training, often shared crowded rooms, their laughter and chatter muffled beneath blankets at night. It was simple reasoning: more bodies meant more heat. Babies, in particular, were wrapped in multiple layers of linen and wool. A cradle could be placed by the fireplace or even inside the mother's bed, her body heat shielding the infant from the cold air. One vivid story from a 14th century chronicle describes a noble child, sleeping by the fire in a wicker crib, wrapped in furs and covered with a canopy. It shows how far families went to protect their youngest, yet illness and cold still claimed many lives. Medieval parents constantly feared winter might take a child during the night. The elderly faced similar dangers. Frail bodies generated less heat and suffered more from drafts. In peasant cottages, grandparents often slept near the fire, while younger adults endured colder spots. In castles, older relatives might be placed in smaller chambers or moved into the kitchen during the coldest months. A curious letter from Burgundy tells of an elderly woman who insisted on sleeping in the bakehouse, claiming the oven's residual warmth made her feel young again. Medical texts from the era often recommended special measures for children and the elderly: heated stones wrapped in cloth at their feet or mulled drinks to boost the humors. They warned that sudden chills could snuff out the flame of life, highlighting how vulnerable these groups were. Historians still debate whether medieval families showed extra care for children and elders or simply practiced the same survival strategies as everyone else. Some believe that the focus on protecting them reveals genuine compassion. The crackle of logs, the rustle of swaddling cloth, the wheeze of an old man shifting under blankets. There's a sense of fragility in the air, as if cold waits silently for a moment of weakness to strike. Remember, medieval sleep wasn't the same for everyone. Children and elders bore the greatest risk, their survival relying heavily on others' warmth. During those long nights, every blanket, ember, and whispered prayer counted. These moments show that medieval sleep was less about individual endurance and more about community care. The young and old relied on the watchfulness and compassion of those around them to survive winter's grip. The cold wasn't just a surface threat, it shaped notions of health itself. For medieval minds, cold wasn't merely uncomfortable, it was dangerous, capable of throwing the body's balance off and inviting disease. Medicine was rooted in the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and doctors believed temperature was essential to keeping these fluids in harmony. Too much cold meant the humors congealed, clogging the body and causing illness. Medical texts from the 13th and 14th centuries are packed with advice for fighting cold at night. One manual recommends rubbing warm oil on feet before bed to open pores and dispel the chill. Another suggests drinking warmed milk with honey to soothe the stomach and keep the humors flowing smoothly. Warmth was seen as medicine itself, prescribed through clothing, food, drink, and close proximity to others. Brewing herbal teas of nettle or chamomile for children, believing the warmth would stave off coughs. Men wrapped their legs in vinegar-soaked wool to boost circulation. In these homes, practice merged superstition and science, giving people a sense of control in a world where illness often seemed unavoidable. Ironically, many treatments for cold actually caused problems. Fires filled lungs with smoke, heavy blankets worsened joint pain, oily ointments gathered dirt. But to medieval minds, these costs were minor compared to the danger of frost seeping into the body. Better to cough in a smoky room than to freeze in a cleaner one. Severity varied, but waking to icy rooms was never entirely out of reach. Picture yourself waking at dawn's dim light, breathe fogging in the cold air. Your bed curtains are stiff, edged with frozen crystals. When you reach for the basin, your fingers meet ice instead of water. Your joints ache from the cold, and leaving the covers feels like a punishment. The vivid sensory scene captures the sharp sting of icy fabric, the brittle crack of wood shrunken by frost, broken only by the faint drip of melting ice. Scraping away ice, piling on blankets, whispering prayers, braving mornings that felt just as harsh inside as out. Now, picture yourself not in a castle, but on the road, far from familiar chambers. Medieval travel was slow, tough, and dangerous, and when night fell, the problem of warmth grew even worse. Castles had fireplaces and tapestries, peasants had their hearths, but travelers, pilgrims, merchants, and wandering souls had to find shelter wherever they could, most often inns. The medieval inn wasn't the cozy postcard image you might imagine. Usually, it was a timber building with a smoky hall, crowded rooms, and beds shared with strangers. Guests might cram 3 or 4 into a single mattress, with thin blankets and no privacy. But, crucially, inns provided warmth. The big hall fire blazed for everyone, and people huddled together, cooling their heat. One traveler in 15th century Italy complained that the beds teemed with vermin, but admitted that at least being among others kept him from freezing. Imagine crawling into a straw-filled mattress, squeezing beside 2 strangers, the smell of ale and sweat filling your nostrils. Not pleasant, but at least your toes stayed alive through the night. There were even more unusual accommodations. Some inns were so poorly equipped that guests ended up sleeping in stables. Walking into the hall, met with the hum of voices and flickering firelight. The smell of ale, smoke, and roasting meat surrounds you. A space clears on a straw pallet, and you squeeze in beside strangers. The floor creaks, dogs bark, mugs clang, all woven into the warm embrace of the crowd that relaxes your limbs. Later, as the hall quiets and snoring replaces chatter, you feel the press of bodies nearby, the faint glow of embers in the hearth. It's not comfort as we know it, but it's enough. The sensory details stay with you: the rough straw beneath thin linen, the heavy scent of sweat and smoke, the steady rhythm of sleeping breaths. You shift slightly, trying not to wake your neighbor, until eventually the murmuring settles into a shallow but vital sleep. Even nobles faced this reality when traveling. Royal progresses required armies of attendants, and inns quickly overflowed. Records describe monarchs lodging in monasteries or taking over entire households for their retinues. Yet, even kings couldn't escape this basic challenge. Take the cold seriously, or it will claim you. The vigil of fires, the yelps of dogs and busy servants, all fades as if a curtain has fallen across the world. Your breathing slows. Each inhale tastes faintly of smoke and wool, each exhale drifts into stillness. The sounds of boots on stone, shutters banging, monks chanting, soften into whispers. The castle itself seems to sleep, stones holding silence like a promise. Picture yourself safe inside your cocoon. The dog at your feet shifts in size. The last candle flickers out, and darkness wraps you like another blanket. The cold remains, yes, but you no longer fight it. You accept it as those before you did, knowing sleep is a fragile truce with the night. Your body grows heavy, thoughts dissolve into shapes and colors. The medieval world, with its chill and smoke, becomes distant, like frost melting in sunlight. What remains is simply calm. You are warm enough. Safe enough. Tired enough. And with that, the story ends. The hearth flickers once more. The bed holds you, and the long night gently carries you into dreams. Rest now, as they once did, wrapped in quiet resilience. Sweet dreams. The stories of those who succumbed to frost, and the quiet triumphs of those who endured. Each story carried a lesson: respect the night, guard against the cold, never assume survival is guaranteed. Finally, you return to the hearth, the symbol that held every medieval sleeper in its warm glow. The fire wasn't just a tool, it was the soul of the household, the thin line between life and death on winter nights. Its flickering shadows danced across the walls, seeming to move like guardians, flickering and shifting with the flames. Sleeping in a castle was a constant conversation with fire. You feared it, needed it, and couldn't survive without it. The hearth's presence touched every sense: the crackle of logs beating like a heartbeat, sparks leaping upward, leaving faint trails of light that vanished into the chimney. The scent of burning resin clung to tapestries and hair, while heat radiated unevenly, baking your face but leaving your back freezing. The hearth was both savior and tormentor, life-giver and smoky tyrant. Nobles saw fire as a sign of status. A blazing hearth meant wealth, the ability to command servants to gather endless fuel, to strip forests if needed, and keep flames alive through the night. Some households even kept fire wardens, servants whose only job was to ensure the embers never went out. Letting the hearth grow cold was more than an inconvenience, it was a mark of shame. But the poorest people also gathered around their modest fires with the same reverence. Peasants hunched on earthen floors, huddled with family and animals, watching flames lick at rough logs. They laughed, spun stories, prayed, and passed around bowls of stew. Their fires weren't picture-perfect stone hearths, but their comfort was just as real. Whether in castle or cottage, fire brought people together and made sleep possible. A traveler in Germany once described villages sitting around their fires before bed, stretching out their hands toward the flames, whispering blessings as if the fire itself were sacred. They believed the flames carried their hopes into the night, guarding them as they slept. It shows how practical need often blended into ritual. Fire wasn't just warmth, but spirit, memory, faith. Historians still debate how much of this reverence was just survival instinct in fancy dress, or genuine spirituality fire woven into their beliefs, rituals, and cosmology. Maybe both are true. People in medieval times lived so close to danger that fire became more than mere fuel, it took on meaning. Now, picture yourself back in that imagined castle once more. The bed curtains are drawn, blankets piled high. Outside, wind howls over the towers, snow hisses against shutters, and the night presses in heavy. But inside the hearth, embers still glow. Their faint light slips through the cracks in the curtains. You close your eyes, hearing the soft sigh of flames, knowing they're the fragile line keeping out the cold. The sensory experience feels complete. The lingering taste of smoke on your tongue. The heaviness of wool and fur across your chest. The warmth of a dog curled at your feet. The faint whisper of a prayer echoing in your mind. You drift toward sleep, aware that medieval nights were never easy, never guaranteed, but always fought for with tricks, rituals, and any warmth you could find. In the end, castles were built as fortresses against men, not winter. What really protected their inhabitants wasn't stone or steel, but resilience, ingenuity, and community. Surviving the night meant sharing blankets, passing around heat, burning fuel, and holding on to hope. Against the endless cold of the medieval dark, humanity itself was the true fire. Now, slow the pace a bit. Imagine the embers fading faintly, their light gentle now, like coals after a long burn. The chamber is still. The wind outside hums softly, fading into a distant murmur. You feel the weight of blankets, heavy, protective, pressing you down into the mattress. The struggle.